In his leadership campaign, Rishi Sunak pledged not to build more onshore wind farms. But now he's been forced into a U-turn. The Financial Times report this. On Tuesday evening, Sunak said the government would consult on changes to the national planning policy to head off a potential rebellion by his own MPs, including Liz Truss. Under the proposals, onshore wind farms would go ahead if they could demonstrate local support and address any negative impacts identified by the local community. Councils would no longer have to pre-designate the location of wind turbines in their so-called local plans, which they're required to draw up to set out their economic priorities. Now, that's all a little bit wonky, but the effect of this would be to reverse an effective ban which has been in place on onshore wind since 2015. David Cameron introduced that in response to pressure from NIMBY backbenchers. They were concerned they didn't want these wind farms in their constituency, and then the law ended up being if a single person objects to a wind farm, it can't happen. That's why it's an effective ban. On the face of it, this U-turn, this reversal, is a welcome move. But Ed Miliband said the U-turn doesn't go far enough.
I'm afraid that what they've announced will still leave, even if they go ahead with it, and this will apparently take months, it will still leave onshore wind in a almost unique position in relation to planning. So it'll be harder to build onshore wind than incinerators or landfill sites. Now, why is that so ridiculous? It's ridiculous because onshore wind is one of the cheapest, cleanest forms of power we have. It's supported by the public. So Rishi Sunak has been pushed by some of his backbenchers into a partial change of heart, but it isn't nearly enough.
Right. The Green Party MP Caroline Lucas also has concerns about the announcement. She said this on Radio 4.
There is a real risk that this announcement around onshore wind is going to be linked to announcements probably later today or later this week, which will see the government give a green light to a new Cumbria coal mine, the first new coal mine in Britain for 30 years. Now, if that goes ahead, no number of onshore wind farms will be enough to counteract the damage of a climate-busting, backward-looking coal mine. And if it is the case that essentially one group of MPs are being bought off by an announcement on onshore wind in order to be able to let a dirty coal mine go ahead, that I think would be absolutely shameful.
So we have now had an announcement on that coal mine. We will be going to that new development in one moment. But first of all, I want to show you an interview I had earlier about whether this was just a quid pro quo and whether the reform to onshore wind planning goes far enough. And I spoke to Ali Warrington from the climate NGO Possible. I started by asking her why we ever had a ban on onshore wind in the first place.
Onshore wind is very, very popular. It's clean, it's cheap. It's a really kind of keystone technology in the clean energy transition that we need. But at the moment, it's virtually banned. So there's a virtual ban on new onshore wind projects in England. And I think that arose really because there's been some dislike from some sections of the Conservative Party from onshore wind. People think that they don't look nice. And there's also a quite an unfounded concern that their constituents don't like the way that wind looks. But, there wasn't really much, reality behind this concern, even back when the wind ban first came in. And, right now the data is really, really clear. People across the UK really, really like wind. There's something like only 4% of people are opposed to onshore wind, which is absolutely tiny.
You're at a campaign group, so I'm sure you sort of speak to politicians. It seems there's a bit of a factional war within the Conservative Party. So it was backbenchers who forced David Cameron into doing this onshore ban, but people who sort of thought their constituents wouldn't like wind farms. Now you've got another set of backbenchers, sort of forcing Rishi Sunak to overturn the ban. So is this how should we understand what's going on with the Conservatives when it comes to wind power?
Yes, I think what this shows is the Conservative Party is still split on wind. And, it's quite frustrating to see this because the UK is in the middle of an energy cost crisis. At the peak of the crisis, wind power was 10 times cheaper than gas power. And, so the fact that some Conservative MPs still think that this is, a terrible thing that they have to resist at all costs really is quite confusing. And, the UK is facing the climate crisis. It's facing the prospect of people going cold this winter, people being pushed into poverty because of unaffordable energy bills. And it is really quite mind-boggling that some Conservative MPs are still so, aggressively opposed to the introduction of a sensible planning system for wind. And, no one is suggesting that wind should be built in inappropriate places or in places where communities don't want it. But at the moment, even communities that really want wind, that want to do their own locally owned wind projects, aren't able to do that. It's just a really, really ridiculous situation.
Labour's Shadow Climate Secretary, Ed Miliband, he sort of, in a way, welcomed the U-turn, but he said it hasn't gone far enough and that it's still going to be pretty difficult to get permission for onshore wind. Is that your assessment as well?
Yeah, I think that's right. So, the government has basically acknowledged that the virtual ban cannot be allowed to stand. So that is positive. But at the same time, the changes that they're actually willing to make are really, really very small, very slow as well. So if they do what they've said they'll do, there will be a slight easing in restrictions in May, and some new wind projects will be able to come forward. So in England. So, okay, yes, this is better than nothing, but, it's not it's not a wholehearted embrace of the opportunities and the potential of onshore wind or of community energy or of renewables. It's the slowest and the most reluctant step forward that I think the government could have possibly done. So, in that respect, it is really quite disappointing because we need so much more. We could do so much better than this. And, this would be popular. It would be good for the UK economy. It would certainly be good for people's energy bills. It would cut emissions. And the slow pace of change that the government is willing to allow is really, it's disappointing.
And another politician, Caroline Lucas, has sort of suggested that even if this U-turn is a good thing, it might be a quid pro quo with other Conservatives who want a new coal mine in Cumbria. And so he's sort of saying, okay, I'll do this one little good thing for the climate if you let me off when I say yes to a coal mine later in the week. Is that your analysis? Do you think this could be in exchange? He's saying, okay, we'll have some onshore wind, but the deal is we'll also get a coal mine.
That would be completely shocking and disgraceful. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that happened. But yeah, that would be absolutely appalling. It's really, really clear that there is no case at all for new coal. The industry that the government have claimed this coal mine is for have been very clear that they don't want it and it won't help them. There is absolutely no climate case for new coal. We need to be closing existing coal mines, if anything. And I think, if the government thinks that they'll be able to get this coal mine through without opposition, public opposition, just because they've said, okay, maybe we can have a little bit more wind at some point over the next year or two, then I think, I don't think people will be happy with that at all. It is still the case that even if the government do what they've said they will do to ease the blocks on wind, it will still have a tighter planning regime than for new coal mines like this Cumbria project. Again, it's absolutely ridiculous. There is no public support for coal. There's a huge amount of support for renewables. And, the energy crisis that is pushing people into poverty in cold homes at the moment is caused by fossil fuels. The last thing we need is more dirty energy.
And where is Britain in general when it comes to the energy transition? I think at some points this year, the majority of our energy was coming from wind. It seems like there was, the change was a bit quicker than we might have expected 5 or 10 years ago. Where would you rate us? 1 out of 10?
Yeah, it's a really tough one to put a numerical value on. I'll give this maybe about a 5. There has been some progress. The grid has, more renewables on it than it used to. And there's been times when, the grid has been largely powered by renewables for periods of time, which is fantastic. But there is scope to go so much further. The government should be showing ambition in getting us off dirty, expensive energy as quickly as possible. We shouldn't be lingering over this because energy is something that is relatively easy to decarbonize, and it's actually cheaper to do so. And decarbonizing other sectors like heat and transport is going to need a huge amount more clean power. So this really is something that the government should be showing much more urgency and ambition on.
So that was Ali Warrington from the NGO Possible. Now, as I've suggested, since doing that interview, a decision has been made on the coal mine in Cumbria, and it has been given the go-ahead. It would be the first new coal mine in Britain for 30 years. This is a reporting from The Guardian on the decision. Michael Gove, the Levelling Up Secretary, gave the green light for the project on Wednesday, paving the way for an estimated investment of £165 million that will create 500 new jobs in the region and produce 2.8 million tonnes of coking coal a year, largely for steelmaking. The mine will also produce an estimated 400,000 tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions a year, increasing the UK's emissions by the equivalent of putting 200,000 cars on the road. The vast majority of the coal produced will be for export, as most UK steel producers have rejected the use of the coal, which is high in sulphur and surplus to their needs. Where these exports will go is uncertain, as most European steelmakers are turning away from the use of coal and adopting green methods such as electric arc furnaces and renewable energy. The government said the mine was possible within the UK's climate legislation, which requires the UK to reach net zero emissions by 2050, as operations will shut down by 2049.
Both employers and workers are waiting for the industrial strategy that will show us how we will do a managed transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to a clean and green economy in a way that doesn't sacrifice workers and workers' rights. That industrial strategy is absent. And so they're just commissioning this coal mine, using this false climate versus jobs narrative in order to cover for their own incompetence. And not only that, but a lot of the time, these jobs that are created by the fossil fuel industry, they're not good quality jobs and they're not sustainable jobs. Like when you see there, then they say, oh, it's fine, we're going to wind down operations by 2049. Okay, that might seem like a really long time away, like just under 30 years away. But it shows that this is not the kind of industry, not the kind of job creation that will hold together communities across generations. These are unsustainable jobs. They are typically very precarious jobs. When you speak to workers that are currently in the oil and gas industry, many of them have considered leaving the industry in the past several years because the working conditions have gotten so bad. And particularly over COVID, many oil and gas workers were fired without access to furlough. So these are bad quality jobs. And the government, through its own incompetence and through its own lack of political will, is missing this golden opportunity to create high quality, sustainable jobs whilst also creating a greener economy. And so we're not looking at climate versus jobs here. Under the Conservative government, we're looking at this dystopian image of crappy jobs and a crappy climate plan. And so I think that it's really important that we don't allow, and it's important also to understand why workers are concerned and why workers are anxious about what a transition to a green economy can look like. Because when you look historically, when we've seen big shifts, big economic shifts, for example, deindustrialization under Margaret Thatcher, typically these shifts have happened in the name of a greater sort of economic reason. But in reality, what it's looked like for local communities is complete abandonment. You saw the closing down of mines in the 1970s, and those communities were just left with nothing. And so I understand why workers are nervous, particularly given that we are under a Conservative government that doesn't give a flying F about workers' rights and what happens to these communities. So it's really important that as the climate movement builds that trust with workers, but also pushes the government to produce that industrial strategy that will outline how we can do that managed transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to a green economy in a way that not only doesn't sacrifice workers' rights, but actually boosts workers' rights and takes us away from this extractive, capitalist and horrendous industry that not only has destroyed our planet, but has also destroyed and has a strong record of union busting and destruction of workers' rights.